I am delighted to introduce psychotherapist Caroline Hickman, a researcher from the University of Bath. Caroline is the lead author on a Lancet Planetary Health study arguing that climate anxiety is a healthy response to the climate crisis. She advises anyone experiencing it to make contact with others who feel the same way and collaborate with them on practical steps to address the crisis. She has many, many years of clinical practice working with young people and talking about climate change. Hello, Caroline.
Yes, hello. Thanks for asking me along here.
That's a delight, honestly. So, is climate anxiety a new thing? Is it real? Is it just something that media have become massively fixated upon recently?
Great question. It's absolutely not a new thing. It's been around for decades, but many years ago, it was primarily experienced by environmentalists, by conservationists, scientists, who saw what was happening with the planet and were really worried about it. But that was quite a specialist group. Let me read you this. The ecologist Raymond Dasman says that World War III has already begun. It's the war of industrial humans against the earth. He's correct. All of us are warriors on one side or another in this war. There are no sidelines, no civilians. Ours is the last generation that will have the choice of wilderness, clean air, abundant wildlife, and expansive forests. The crisis is that severe. Problem is, this was written in 1970. So we've known for decades just how bad it is before this. So the climate anxiety and distress that we talk about today, if you like, we're coming back to it afresh, anew, where there's a new dawning and an awakening to this, but it has been around for decades, but with small specialist groups of people. Now it's gone into mainstream awareness, public awareness. Why has that happened? Well, that has happened because the world is getting significantly worse rapidly. And so as this happens, climate change gets worse. The IPCC reports flag up warnings increasingly. The public wakes up, politicians wake up, activists are shouting louder, and everyone becomes more aware of it. It is absolutely not new. What is new is the fact that we're running out of time to deal with it. That is new. So I was an environmental activist in the 1970s and 1980s, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. And to some extent, maybe I was naive, but we thought we would deal with this. We really thought, how could we not deal with this? It was logical, right? Anyone would look at what was going to happen and think, oh, we'll deal with that. And we dealt with the ozone layer. We dealt with all sorts of things by taking action. So, of course, you would expect to then deal with this. But that is not what happened. So that is what happened was a lot of misinformation, disinformation from fossil fuel companies, from governments struggling to know how to wrap their heads around this, from economic pressure and power. And we not only slowed down in dealing with it, but actually went the other way quite a lot of the time. So when you want to understand climate anxiety, we should be anxious, but what gives it that edge of extra anxiety today is the fact that for decades, we've done the opposite of what we needed to do. So that's why I would argue it makes complete sense. When we define climate anxiety, I think we have to be really clear that climate anxiety is only partly in relation to climate change. Of course, looking at what's happening with climate and biodiversity is going to make us stressed and anxious. It is not only a sign of mental health, but actually you only feel this because you care. If you don't care, you're not going to feel it. So actually, I would want to support and celebrate people feeling it. I would say, well, you feel this because you care. You should be proud that you care. And I know it's uncomfortable. Let's deal with the discomfort, but let's not try and get rid of your climate anxiety because it is a sign of mental health, right?
Absolutely. And young people particularly care about animals. You know, they learn about animals and wildlife from very early age. And nowadays it's, oh, let's learn about, you know, the tigers and they're dying out. And we can learn about the elephants and they're struggling. And we can learn about the polar bears and they're struggling. So for young people who care about this wildlife, this magical planetary biodiversity that we have, they can really care, and it can be very, very personal to them that they struggle to understand what they can do about it. They feel a little bit hopeless.
They can do. There's two things to add to this. I like what you're saying. I agree with you, but there's two things I want to add. So the first thing is, particularly in Western industrialized society, how do we teach children about emotions and about relationship? We use books like this.
Recognize it.
We buy them books
It's
on bunny rabbits and puppies and kittens, and we promote that as a way of developing empathy care for specific pets as well as the environment. So we deliberately set that up as part of our child development process. And we would worry if children exhibited, you know, cruel or hurtful behavior towards a pet, right? So that is part of our cosmology, particularly in Western industrialized society, not exclusively. So then why would we get confused that we've taught them to care about animals and we've taught them about empathy for animals, and then we would get confused when they feel this deep empathy for animals? So that's one thing. This is our problem, not their problem. The other thing psychologically that's really important in what you just said is it's not just that children care about animals, they identify with them. Because children and animals and indigenous people and low-lying islands have not caused climate change. They are not responsible, but they are paying the price of inheriting this world where we collectively, older, usually white folk, have created this problem. So children identify with the innocence and the helplessness of animals and the unfairness. Children over and over again say to me, it's not fair to animals and it's not fair to children. And so that sense of injustice and unfairness about being given this thing that they haven't caused, that they will inherit, is particularly difficult. And this is why in the Lancet Planetary Health paper, we said, well, okay, climate anxiety is a sign of mental health, but we don't want to ignore the suffering. What is that suffering about? So that's why we went to, well, it's a form of moral injury. The very people who are supposed to be protecting you and taking care of you, looking after you, are the people who are hurting you and telling you to stop worrying about it. And that hurts in a very, very different way, because it's what's being hurt there is your feelings about what's going on and the relationship. So climate anxiety is partly triggered by climate change, but the other half of it, which we could do something about this afternoon, is the fact that people around children and young people often do not care enough, or don't tell the children they care, or don't open it up for children to talk with them. One of the statistics in the 2021 research, so we talked about how children feel, how they think, and then we asked, what happens when you try and talk to other people about climate change? And 48% in the UK and globally told us they were dismissed or ignored when they tried to talk about climate change. Now, there is no other subject that we would think is okay to tell children to be quiet when they try and talk about. If they talk about grief or anger or being bullied or being hurt or racism or homophobia, you wouldn't dismiss or ignore a child. But we do dismiss and ignore children around climate change, and that hurts them.
I know. And the Teach the Future survey said that 70% of teachers didn't feel comfortable and about teaching or discussing climate change with young people because, you know, a lot of them haven't had training or, you know, understand the wider picture, or it's not even in the national curriculum hardly, you know, especially in primary. So
Well,
it's
and that's one of the problems. It gets turned into this big scary thing to talk. It's a bit like having a sex education conversation with your teenagers. You know, it's like you build it up, build it up, build it up, avoid it, and then sit down and talk to them, and they roll their eyes, and they possibly know more than you. So takes on that kind of quality. So I know we're going to talk more about practical things in a minute, but at this point, here's my reassurance to teachers. It's actually easier than you think, because you don't need to be completely knowledgeable at absolutely everything. You just need to be 2 steps ahead of the majority of the children. There will always be a few children there that know more than you do and know more than I do. And the way to approach that is say, here's what I know, let's find out about the rest together. Because actually what children want to hear is that you're interested, you're engaged, and you're sharing what knowledge you've got, and you don't have to have all the answers.
and it's literally the world's most important lesson. So the kids are engaged. They want to know about it. They want to discuss it. You know, so that's what I found in my classrooms is that,
Yeah.
you know, any of those underlying behavior issues and all the rest of it, they just go because it's
Yeah.
actually something that children know that they should be learning about.
You're absolutely right. But what they also need alongside that is to know that adults can be trusted to talk about difficult things, even if you haven't got all the answers. You know, it's okay for us to not know
Absolutely.
absolutely.
I have no idea what the answers are.
Yeah. So I spend a lot of time saying to children, you know, I'm sorry, I don't have all the answers, but I'm really happy to talk about this. Let's find out ways to talk about it. You tell me what you know. You educate me. I'll share with you what I know. And we'll figure out the rest as we go. That is what reassures children, is that you're not silencing them, dismissing them, disallowing it. And you're not either going to collapse because, you know, children are scared sometimes that adults will just be like, oh, I don't know, and I feel so guilty. Or that they'll just go, oh, dismissive. Oh, don't be silly. You know, we need to focus on the lesson here, type of thing. So you can be too hard or too soft. What children need to see is us navigating that kind of emotional resilience and emotional intelligence to navigate these things, because then it's applicable and it's transferable. Because the thing about climate change is it's constantly changing.
Yeah.
So we can struggle to keep up. So we need to be constantly adapting the way we have these conversations about it
Yep.
and see that as opportunities rather than obstacles. These are live opportunities for these conversations. We won't be thanked for avoiding the difficult conversations,
No, not
because
at all.
all that happens, it just goes underground. A number of times, you know, I've heard parents, and they're loving, good parents, say, oh, I don't think my child thinks about climate change. And so I then say, well, let's ask them, right? Have you asked them? And honestly, these are great parents. And we ask them, and the child knows tons about it and has been worrying about it for years. And when you say, oh, how long have you been worrying about this? It's like, oh, 2 years, 3 years. It's like, well, they don't know because they're not asking. And if you're worried about asking, you can get it wrong in 2 directions. You can get it wrong by doing too little or get it wrong by doing too much. I'd rather get it wrong by doing too much and then say, oh, sorry, that was too much, than be seen to avoid it.
Yeah.
Because if you avoid it, you are communicating the message of this doesn't matter, you're not allowed to talk about it. And that then just shuts everybody down,
No.
and it doesn't go away, it just goes underground, and then it bursts out. And, you know, I know children who have fallen out with their friends because their friends don't want to talk about it, and they do want to talk about it. I know children that are struggling to talk to their parents about it. And this is, if you like, relational pain and trauma and distress that isn't necessary. Yeah, we need to tackle the
Yeah.
climate crisis, but we also need to tackle the relational complexity around it. And that we can do a lot at the same time.
Absolutely. And so when you're looking at young people and talking to them, how do you measure climate related stress? How do you actually assess, if somebody is displaying real anxiety or if they're just that sad, and can you measure this?
Well, we don't have, so when we talk about measurement, we don't have clinical psychology scales around this particularly. We have some being developed, but they're primarily being developed for adults. And adult mental health is measured and evaluated very differently to children's mental health. The thing about children is that they are constantly learning and growing and changing. So we don't want fixed diagnoses around children's mental health at too young an age, because some of the mental health stuff that children might encounter and struggle with can just disappear by the time they reach adulthood. So that's all a bit long-winded. You're probably better off editing that out. But we need to recognize that children's mental health is often assessed and measured differently to adult mental health. We can't measure it as such, but frequently it's about asking the right questions, asking children, what is it that's worrying you? What is it that's on your mind? And there's a piece of research which is not yet published, but will be, which I'm doing with Greenpeace. And this was a poll conducted by YouGov, and this was last year. And this was with very young children, 6 to 12-year-olds. We asked about a range of things that made them anxious. We asked about the cost of living crisis, the war in Ukraine, and climate change. And 80% of 6 to 12-year-olds told us they were worried about climate change in that poll, right? And we gave them other things that they could talk about that they were worried about. Those other things, it's not that they're not worried, but they're less concerned because those are very much adult constructs and adult concerns. A war in a different country, a cost of living crisis, that's adults need to worry about that on behalf of children, because there's very little they can do about either of those things. But when it comes to climate change, it's often a lot more personal for children, and they can feel, well, I need to do something.
Yeah,
Because
and
it's my world.
that expectation of individual action, from the very words, your own carbon footprint, which was thought up by, I think, an oil industry, it puts that impetus on the self rather than on the systems. And we
It
need
is.
individual action, but we also really need them to understand that this is going to involve system change. Those adults in the room should be making those better decisions.
Yes, I don't disagree with the word you're saying, but I want to go back a couple of steps before that, because what you're saying, I don't disagree with the word you're saying, but it's very action oriented. And I think before we get to the action, which is really important, we need to have understanding. Otherwise, what we're doing is kind of taking quick action to try and reduce distress, and which is understandable. I want to
And for
reduce
busy
distress.
teachers, you see, it's from the perspective of a busy teacher, just try and have a class of 30 kids and trying to get some of these discussions going. Sometimes it's quite, the action is quite important, but on the individual basis, that dialogue is difficult. It's challenging.
Yes, I understand that. I've done a lot of projects. I understand that, and I've done a lot of projects in schools, in primary schools and secondary schools, working with teachers and working with groups of children, sometimes mixed age groups, exploring how can we find ways to talk about this that we can then integrate and embed within the curriculum and make it a mixed part of the curriculum. So we talk about it within art classes, within English classes, within science and maths classes. It doesn't have to be standalone. You can actually have little bits of time in each class where you connect with these subjects. So we did a project where we planted a crocus whale, 2,500 crocus bulbs on a primary school playing field in the shape of a baby humpback whale. And we got the children to draw it. We got the children to measure it and calculate the number of bulbs we needed, maths.
Cross-curricular.
We got them to storyboard it,
You can talk about
English.
plant
Yeah.
life cycles,
We educated them about the life cycle of humpback whales. So we got some ecology and natural history in there. We were listening to whale music. I got asked a lot of questions I couldn't always answer, like how much urine does a baby humpback whale pee every day? Don't you just love those
Love kids,
questions?
love them.
Love those questions. I'm like, I don't know, but I will find out. And the answer is a bath full, because they drink a bath full of milk every day. So it's going to go in, it's going to come out the other side. We dealt with questions like, what's the difference between a whale shark and a whale and a shark? Love it, right? So we integrated that project across the curriculum and had little bits in each of these subject areas whilst growing this whale, which was spaced out over a few months. And we saw an enormous impact on the way the children related to climate change and felt able to talk about climate change through the whale. We also did a lot of storytelling. So we had this whale that came to the children in their school to talk to them about climate change and educate them.
As you
And the
say,
whale told so beautiful imaginal exercises where the whale told the children a story and the children told the whale a story.
And by spreading it across the curriculum, by spreading it through, and it makes it a lot less heavy and weighted than just saying we're just going to take this lesson and talk about it now. You
Yeah.
spread it thin, and then they get the whole big picture, and that's beautiful. And I love the whale.
It was the most fun. And
So
it
do
really
you?
was about how to talk about difficult things without frightening children, but also make it playful and make it visual, make it engaging, and create something. So they chose which baby we were going to plant. We gave them a choice of a blue whale or a baby humpback. They chose. We involved them in the planting. We involved them in every aspect of the project and the decision making. So they owned it.
And they work together to make this.
Yeah,
I think
and
that's
they
that's
went out. My favorite bit was the headmaster sent us an email to tell us that before the crocus bulbs grew, so it was all underground, parents used to cut across that bit of the playing field to go and pick their children up, and the children didn't want them walking on that whale, even though it wasn't grown yet. And they put a circle of chairs around it. They took their chairs out of the classroom and they put a sign up saying, "Don't walk on the whale." So I love this. This is the children forming relationship with the whale, developing this eco-consciousness, this relationship and love and compassion for the environment and their whale, educating their parents about it, protecting it, defending it. We want to talk about how to support children become, environmentally conscious. Then that project worked beautifully because the children cared about that whale.
I mean, that's an amazing picture in my head now. So in terms of teachers, busy teachers, primaries, it gives us a little bit more flexibility sometimes, but what would be your top takeaways for teachers to understand how children might present climate anxiety, but also how they can be proactive in helping with their emotional responses and helping them, just get through an escalating climate crisis?
Yeah. we need to we need to get the foundations right, and then everything else will follow from that. So we need to understand that climate distress, climate anxiety can be direct and indirect, and I think this is really important, particularly for teachers in the UK or America or Europe, because there is less direct impact of climate change in these countries at the moment, less wildfires, less flooding. I'm not saying there's no impact, but there is less visible impact. What that means is it can feel like a distant issue. So we need to understand the indirect impact of climate anxiety is just as significant. Reading about it, seeing images on the television, we can have this secondary traumatic experience of it, which can actually make us feel more helpless. So we need to be mindful of that. That does not mean you try and avoid it, but it means you just approach it in ways of saying, okay, this is how it feels if it's a direct impact, but also indirect impact can be just as significant because it doesn't stop us thinking about it. I'm going to say more about that in a second. The other thing to be clear about is it is short-term and long-term. So we have short-term immediate impact, and we have the long-term incremental impact. So what you can do with students is try and differentiate. Let's find examples of short-term, examples of long-term. I think knowledge is power. So let's get examples of direct, examples of indirect. And then you've got something relatable, something you can go, oh yeah, I feel that. I didn't realize that was climate anxiety. Now that makes sense. It actually reduces. What we have to be always cautious about is the secondary emotions, the feelings about the feelings. It's the anxiety about the anxiety, which is often more problematic. So we get anxious, and then we get anxious about the fact we've got anxious, or we think we shouldn't be anxious, or we get a bit sad or depressed, and then we get depressed about the fact we got depressed. And then we give ourselves a hard time and say, you've got nothing to be depressed about. Well, then this is not going to help us, right? We want to be compassionate and understanding. That's why I want people to have this understanding about the nature of what we're talking about, as well as the nature of the emotions that we can feel in relation to it. All of these emotions make complete sense. So when we're talking about climate anxiety, we've missed the boat on calling it something more sensible, because it's out there and people are recognizing it and relating to it. And I don't really mind what people call it. I want them to understand it. But it's not just anxiety, it's also sadness. It's also fear. It's also frustration. It's also anger. We will sometimes have fantasies of rescue, or we will have apocalyptic fantasies. We will emotionally range around. I call this a kind of emotional biodiversity, that in the same way as we need plants, giraffes, fleas, wasps, bees, water, air, we need ecological biodiversity. We also need emotional biodiversity. And as soon as we start calling one emotion good and another one bad, or we call something right and another one wrong, we're in terrible, terrible trouble.
That's really
because
unhelpful.
it doesn't stop you feeling those things. And then you just get embarrassed or ashamed, or you tell yourself you shouldn't feel those things whilst you're feeling them anyway. So the best thing to do is allow all of those emotions. You just don't want any of them to completely take over. So you allow yourself to move through them. I've tried to map what that can look like, and I will send you that diagram so you can include it visually as part of the recording. So it's a model based on in a book called Holding the Hope, and it maps the climate anxiety journey from anxiety into sadness and depression and hopelessness. We all have to have a little bit of hopelessness. But the point of this is, don't set up home there. Don't get stuck in that feeling of hopelessness. Visit it and then process it, allow it, and move on. What helps us move on and move through that is recognizing sadness, grief about what's happening to the planet, and connection and love and vulnerability. And then we can develop it into, we can transform eco-anxiety into eco-empathy, eco-anxiety into eco-compassion, eco-community, eco-action. I don't want to get rid of the anxiety, but I'm keen for it to be transformed into other things. And then we can move towards meaning, and we are then at a higher level of functioning than when we went in. If we try and do a shortcut, which sometimes people try to do, the cure for eco-anxiety is eco-action. It makes me want to chew furniture, because A, it doesn't need to be cured because it's not a mental illness. B, I don't want to get rid of it. And C, we actually need to be rooted as well in that sadness and grief, because that is love. That is because we care.